Hey guys, my name is Steven. I'd like to welcome you back to my calibration channel. I'd also like to welcome back my two SPC experts, Maddie and Carl. Today in this video, I want to talk about a wonderful article I read by Dr. Jody Muelaner. In it, he puts Gauge R&R, SPC, and the gum method all in the same framework. And for me, this had some very exciting implications and results. I consider myself very lucky to have stumbled across this article. It was like a bolt from the blue, or at the very least, a very happy accident. Now that these methods are placed in the same framework, I can see that metrology is going to have to do some radical changing if it wants to keep up with this Internet of Things nonsense we got going on. Please give me a couple minutes to explain myself. Jody is a brilliant and active mechanical engineer who's attached to the University of Bath in England. He says that going forward, we have to unify the methods we call the gum, SPC, and Gauge R&R into a single method that lives on a single platform so that it can serve worldwide manufacturing needs. Now, the first step he says we're going to have to execute, and one that I certainly agree with him on, is that we have to come up with a common vocabulary, because each of these methods uses different technical terms in order to operate, and they have to be unified. It makes a lot of sense. Next, Jody highlights that currently there's not enough people with the skill sets to support this platform, even if it were to drop down onto our heads from heaven. Not only that, he's talking about people other than industrial engineers. He's talking about owners and operators. In fact, he quotes a businessman who says, "We would benefit from having one clearly defined process to follow, using nice and simple engineering words to explain, and not highly intellectual mathematical jargon. At the end of the day, we are paid for the product we produce. There is no budget to employ math geniuses to run simulations prior to manufacture." Now let's just let that sink in for a second. My training tells me that if I'm going to look at a landscape such as the one that Jody's laying out for us, I want to take a historical perspective. To me, Gauge R&R probably came up in the 1920s among auto manufacturers because they had no industrial metrology to support them, really, and they needed to produce a lot of standardized parts that were produced at tolerances that no one was really used to producing yet. And yet they had a flood of orders coming in, they had to respond. So with little or no formal guidance, these guys came up with what we now call Gauge R&R. Gauge R&R was invented to confront two simultaneous challenges. One is that two auto workers standing side by side could use the same standard to measure the same piece and come up with two different measurements. Or one person using two standards could measure the same piece and still produce two different measurements. Now, this situation continued for at least another 20 years until the beginning of World War II. And with the end of World War II and the subsequent peace, there was a flood of demand not only for cars, but all sorts of new consumer items, which eventually caused the measurement science community to try and get themselves together. This eventually, over 4 decades, produced what we now know as the gum in the early 1990s. It's easy to find intermediary versions of what is now the gum. If you look online, you can find one. And if you look at it, your idea of what we have now for the gum will vastly improve, I believe. What I'm saying is that the Gauge R&R had at least a half-century head start on the gum, during which it was really the only analytical method available to people. And I'm sure over those 50 years, people kept tweaking it and changing it and applying it to situations where maybe it applied and maybe it didn't. So interpretations of what constitutes a Gauge R&R tool has spread over time and has never been nailed down. At present, it appears to me that we have 3 different methods we could call Gauge R&R. 2 of them are in direct conflict with each other. And here I'm referring to the battle between Dr. Don Wheeler and his method and the Automobile Industry Action Group and their method. I don't believe those conflicts have been resolved yet. At any point, right now I need to disclose that as a calibrator, I prefer the gum. And not only because the gum is aimed primarily at the practice of calibration. Going forward, what makes sense to me is to continue to invest in the software and the international politics necessary to make the gum more user-friendly and more universal. And at the same time, let's stop using Gauge R&R methods as separate methods for determining measurement uncertainty instead of the gum. Now I say this because when I look at these two methods, it seems to me Gauge R&R is only a precursor to the gum, but one that was never standardized and has actually been replaced by the gum. Now, despite my disclosure, I'm not saying the gum is perfect. It has two glaring problems with it right on the face of it. The first one's obvious. It's not user-friendly for calibrators. The second one is more fundamental. It's composed from the ground up of two different philosophical approaches. One is Bayesian, one is frequentist. Sometimes you can use either method and you can't tell the difference. Sometimes you can use either method and you see slight differences that you're safe in ignoring. Sometimes these two approaches within the gum can produce paradoxes for which we have no solution at the present time. This has to be fixed. Now, having dispensed with the use of Gauge R&R altogether, let's say that what's left is the gum and SPC. And because I rule the world, I'm saying we've got to keep SPC. That's because SPC is inherently a dynamic way to monitor manufacturing processes. The gum's not like that and was never meant to do that. So these two methods should be unified into a common platform. Now, to conclude, there's one more thing where Jody and I differ slightly. To discuss that, let's talk about traceability again. Traceability is an attribute of measurement results that link them to a hierarchy. Attributes are virtual. They are not objects. Objects can never be traceable. However, the data captured from objects can be traced to the data captured from other objects that we might call standards. Now, why do I keep beating on this seemingly minor little detail? Well, in the future, in fact, in the middle of next year, the metrology world is going to ditch their last physical artifact with which they could assess the quality of the measurements of other standards of the same type. After that date next year, there's going to be no physical artifacts left. They're all going to be virtual. Now, to prepare us for this transition, we need to keep loosening our hold on thinking of any physical object as the source of any measurement assurance. Now, the corollary to that is that we have to continue to get more comfortable with the virtual aspect of measurement data as opposed to continuing to tie ourselves to the physical objects that data characterizes. Clearly, the Internet of Things and metrology are headed on a course that's going to make them intersect. Please, let's make sure this is not a collision course with a whole bunch of damage and confusion. I really like Jody's article. I encourage you to read it and read all of his stuff. You may not agree with my approach or my ideas, but I'd like to hear from you either way. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time and attention.
I got a healing come my way. That's right, I said it. The sun's coming up today. It will be shining.